Welcome to Season 2 of Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Future. This podcast is presented by the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance in partnership with Reimagine Energy. The Alliance is a not-for-profit organization working to develop a thriving, low-carbon hydrogen sector in Atlantic Canada. I'm Derek Estabrook, Executive Director of the Alliance, and your host for this season. Today, we're diving into the energy transition in Western Europe, a key region driving global hydrogen demand. While some skeptics may question the economics and the applications for renewable hydrogen, other people believe that a renewables plus hydrogen economy is not only possible, but essential for a global low-carbon energy system. Erik Rakhou, my guest today, is one of those people. He's the founder of Rakhou Associates. He's also a former Boston Consulting Group consultant and co-author of Touching Hydrogen Future, a book about what a future global hydrogen economy might actually look like. Erik advises clients on energy infrastructure, hydrogen, and how power and gas systems connect. His mission is simple to say, perhaps harder to do: help the world get to net zero. Erik, welcome to the podcast. Erik, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Thank you for a kind introduction, and look forward to discuss why there will be a hydrogen economy, albeit with a delay, and why I see that we are moving from hope to optimism carefully, at least in Western Europe, and I would say in Asia, where both I'm involved.
Okay, well, that's a great place to start because, despite recent headwinds and some skepticism, you remain pretty optimistic about the low carbon hydrogen sector. So I'm curious to know why you think a renewables plus hydrogen economy is essential and what makes you so bullish on this sector.
In my experience, what speaks for itself is that there are contracts being concluded for hydrogen and its derivatives. One of the activities that I deploy as advisor and investor is helping companies close offtake contracts. So at least in my experience, I have a list of 70 buyers of green ammonia that are concluding contracts and looking at commercial options. If you compare, that number 70 on a global scale sounds like, oh, it's just 70, right? You can put them in a room. And if you think about it, it's multi-billion, hundreds of million transactions that are concluded between those buyers and their suppliers globally. It is also, if you think about it, for example, a gas market like the global gas benchmark TTF, which is in the Netherlands, where I also happen to live and work from, it has roughly 40 to 50 very active buyers and sellers. So for a global market to emerge, 70 is a good number, just to reference. Because I think also gas market is a good proxy for how their global hydrogen may develop. So what is that demand then for that hydrogen economy? How do I define a hydrogen economy? For me, a hydrogen economy is a world where part of the oil and gas demand that we have now, and possibly part of the coal demand, is replaced by hydrogen and its derivatives. And the world is on a pathway to do that through a number of use cases. So we see marine. So there are vessels on order that will use methanol and will use ammonia, both derivatives of hydrogen. we see that in transportation, in some markets, there is, let's say, where frequent users, we see cars and trucks and trains being used. It's always not the main case as electrification proceeds, but there is a case. And then we see things like power generation. For example, currently in Germany, a hydrogen ready and CCS ready power generation is being discussed. We see also high temperature heat that is hard to abate. That's where parties look at into hydrogen. And then we see chemical refining and fertilizer industry that are also actively looking to hydrogen. And also European rules, in as an example, are helping them to have an ambitious target to implement that. So all these use cases together make for a hydrogen economy partially replacing the fossil fuels. So the drivers haven't disappeared. The only thing that did happen globally over the last few years is that immense focus on sustainability has gone to the background for many companies. And it's much more about sovereignty and security and then economics. And if you take those together, hydrogen is still a really interesting option to help to be both energy secure and sovereign when and if we start investing today so that we can benefit from learning curves and economics.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to me that despite some of these headwinds, the International Energy Agency's 2025 Global Hydrogen Review shows some pretty encouraging signs, like the number of projects that reached final investment decision grew by about 20% last year. Low emissions hydrogen production has increased by about 60% in the last 4 years. And installed electrolyzer capacity grew ninefold between 2021 and 2025. And even from an investment standpoint, the amount of investment in electrolyzers and CCUS projects increased from about $500 million back in 2021 to almost $8 billion last year. So, that is a lot of progress. Yet many projects still seem to struggle to get to a final investment decision. So I'm interested to know, in Europe, what do you think is stopping these projects from getting shovels in the ground?
Well, first of all, I absolutely agree on the positive trend. Maybe one disclaimer: what didn't help the whole hydrogen discussion is that some years ago, let's say, predictions were made. I think one of the big American banks said, okay, it's going to be a 1,000 million ton a year, 1 trillion a year type of market. Whilst now I would say it's more likely that from the current 100 million ton a year market, it's more going to be like a 2 to 300 million ton. So let's say we deflated the bubble, which I think there was a bubble, by factor 2 or 3. So that was kind of the general context. And when there is this sentiment that bubble is deflating, then some of the investors become very careful and they ask even more guarantees than in a market where everything is going up. So if you compare, for example, hydrogen and AI market, which I think in some ways we are now, a lot of media even agrees, I would say, seem to be in a bit of a AI bubble. Then you see that investors are much less carefully willing to provide financing on attractive terms. So at least that, let's say, through the phase that hydrogen market now has gone in, for example, versus AI, we see that we are in a deflated state. In that deflated state, the ultimate reason for investors to give financing is that you have a firm A-level credit backers, buyers. So, and there are buyers, as I started saying in this our recording, out there. So at least in my book, there are at least 70 that are credible. So the project that will find the right terms. That you do need to have most economic terms for that, because first of all, people look at what are the economics, are you competitive versus other suppliers? Then after that, what is their features of your product? Are you able to meet, for example, in Europe, the RFNBO, renewable fuels of non-biological origin requirements to be counted as accepted under European mandates and rules? And then thirdly, are you able to deliver? Do you have a clear visibility on your supply chain? Is it, if one signs a contract, is it very, very, very likely that your project will come to completion and you will start delivering? So, obviously it helps if you have an operating track record, a strong team, and backers. So that's a bit of a recipe, I guess, also for you in Canada, where I heard there used to be at least 10 courageous project developers thinking, we're going to help Europe out of its energy dependence on traditional suppliers, and we're going to bring new energy, including through green ammonia value chain between Canada and Europe. And I guess, European initiatives like H2 Global together with Canada, a good example that is still the plan. And I think it's really interesting that this kind of initiatives will continue, because I do think that one thing maybe I just forgot to add to the list of, what makes a good shovel likely, success likely project, next to things like firm demand, excellent team and supply chain, and sustainability requirements met, it is also public support. What you increasingly find that I think in our more geopolitical world than a few years ago, some of their investors and financing institutions also really look for those security guarantees. And if you have some sort of government involvement, it really helps, because they think, okay, if all the projects come to it, then at least this project will continue to get support. So I think also that public sector involvement is really helpful.
Interesting. So here in Atlantic Canada, we often talk about the chicken and egg dilemma, and the dilemma is that hydrogen demand would grow if there was more supply, and supply would grow if there was more demand. So I'm curious to know, in Europe today, what's the real barrier? You think, is it the chicken, is it the egg, or is it something else entirely?
I think maybe to unpack this question, and just think. So let's do a very, very simple exercise. Let's imagine you and I, Derek, we're sitting in a beautiful place overlooking a place in Canada with strong hydro, so very cheap power, and somehow we have some hectares of land, maybe 100 or so, and we have access to it, and we are discussing together, like, should we, start a hydrogen ammonia export project? You could argue something of a similar dilemmas exist elsewhere in the world. There is, for example, live auctions. I think they're about to conclude in Oman, where between 100 and 300 square kilometers are being auctioned to developers so that they can create hydrogen or its derivatives and bring somewhere to the world. There are similar things being thought about in Mauritania and some other places in the world. So let's say we're having that discussion, like, should we start investing our time in that? I think if we then start unpacking it, we first thing we will look to and say, at least a few years ago, we probably would have hired a really great engineering team, started making design, started asking for permits, and And then once we kind of were sure that, okay, we have a really cool design, we know how we are building it, we'd start going to conferences, tell people about it. And that's exactly what we saw happening. And then we started, okay, now I'm always, I know that I can launch my all the technical stuff, and permits look really good. You know what? Now I'm going to try and call some off-takers. And then we were suddenly discovering that off-takers were not that easy at certain price levels. And they were also not very clear what was the pricing model, and because maybe it was better for them to wait, till the technology cost came further down. Maybe there was also suddenly the fossil energy has become again much cheaper again. So the alternatives were not as pressing. They were also getting much more time. The urgency to decarbonize became less. So suddenly the boards of the buyers are like, well, I'm not sure I actually want to sign already something. And then suddenly all these beautiful developments were running into a problem. Now, in this new world where you and I sit, the very first thing we would do is probably first we would use AI and skip all the engineering and just create a bit of a concept. And you can do quite a reasonable feasibility study with use of AI. I've done that in Poland for a small project. And then I gave it to engineers and said, like, wow, that's a really cool feasibility study. Said, well, we've written it using AI. So just to have a concept, because the very next thing you would do is actually start calling energy buyers for companies. And at least in my case, in the project I've done in Poland, I have secured 2 letters of intent from 2 big energy utilities in Europe. And then we started looking at the project and economics further. We eventually decided to abandon that project in Europe, actually, as an example, because the economics on European level didn't work out, because at that state, gas price versus hydrogen and locally produced power didn't work out. But we, at least as a model, did start with concept at low cost, then off-takers, and then dive into further detail. And I think that's what we would also do between you and I in Canada. We would do the concept, we would start going through off-takers, and only afterwards we would start investing millions in development. So does it give you a bit of sense over my vision on chicken and egg?
It does. It does. Thanks for that. And maybe it's a good segue into talking a bit about the elephant in the room, which is around price. So, I mean, you talked about just the reality that over the last couple of years, demand for renewable hydrogen has cooled somewhat as energy affordability and security and geopolitical tensions have kind of taken center stage. And there seems to often be a pretty big price gap between the price that renewable hydrogen producers need to make their projects work and the price that customers are actually prepared to pay. So I'm just curious whether you think this price gap is the real barrier to accelerating the market, and if it is a real barrier, how do you think we can close it?
I think from the European perspective, kind of one of the examples of a benchmark is all the time implicitly. So let's take the green ammonia market. So on one side, there is the gray ammonia, which is created where one of the main price drivers is natural gas, because that's kind of where the hydrogen is made, and then through transformation, you move to ammonia. Where the green ammonia would be European emission trading system carbon price plus gray ammonia. And then plus some sort of premium to strategically already enter market now before the full market develops. And then you would compare that against what other global initiatives are able to offer. So for example, if we were constructing our virtual Canadian Derek and Erik initiative, we would need to see what could we, let's say, get to. I'm just making up numbers here, but let's say roughly, say €700 per ton ammonia, green ammonia, free on board. Could we get to such a number based on Canadian ecosystem access to hydropower. I think we may be able to get there if we had that access to excessive hydropower and very, most advanced de-risked engineering. Maybe we would even collaborate not just with, let's say we do a global competition for technology provision, and we would probably be open to participation of some of the Chinese players. That's no problem, as long as the software that we would operate on the equipment probably be Canadian or European. So I don't mind buying hardware, but I would like to retain sovereign control. And something in that setup, if we can get to 700 euro per ton as an example, and we would then compare and have dialogue with buyers in Europe around how they see their, particularly the risks of gas price again becoming very volatile. We're living in a geopolitical world, and then how they would see the UETS rising. And I think actually both factors would be in favor. And then there is the penalty prices that some of the buyers may get eventually when the varied European rules, be it for marine sector, be it for transportation, be it for the industrial implementation of renewable energy directive, get implemented. Those would also push the buyers to sign.
Do you think that there are lessons to be learned from the wind and solar sectors, where if you look back, 15 or 20 years ago, from a pure economic standpoint, you would not build, wind or solar, but, investments were made, governments supported wind and solar, governments even subsidized wind and solar. And so we got going, even though it was expensive. And now 15 or 20 years later, wind and solar are almost the lowest cost forms of energy. So do you think it was that kind of willingness to get started, even when the economics maybe didn't make sense? Do you think that that might be true in the hydrogen sector as well?
I think, like in any new technology, some form of government support is welcome as long as it has a clear deadline and you see clear progress. And as it, let's say, able to stand on its feet, you need to clearly kind of refocus and design your support in different ways. I think the best support would be just to make sure that carbon pricing in Europe is kind of moving at pace to reflect the desire of Europe to be nearly carbon-free energy economy by 2040 already. So that pricing would give people a choice. And I think then hydrogen will be just part of the solutions that are being taken. So I would still see also, carbon cap. So natural gas together with carbon capture will probably also then be play a role. That's already economic at carbon prices of 160 to 200 euro per ton. And that's already not unthinkable in the 2030s in Europe. And I think that's also probably where hydrogen would compete, depending on, on the lower price power ranges, which are achievable both in Canada and some other parts of the world. And then based on, let's say, these assumptions, yeah, I think we could get there.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot about Europe. I want to end by shifting the discussion to Atlantic Canada. Now, our region has, I think, some pretty important advantages in the renewable hydrogen sector. We have ice-free deep-water ports that give us direct access to European markets. We have wind and a lot of it, both onshore and offshore. In fact, wind is probably our region's most plentiful natural resource. The challenge is we can't ship wind to Europe, but we can turn it into green hydrogen, into green ammonia, green methanol, or sustainable aviation fuel. And I think one other big advantage is, as Prime Minister Mark Carney said recently during a speech at the World Economic Forum, and that is that Canada is a stable, reliable partner in a world that is anything but. And that, I think, may be our most important advantage, at least today. So I'm interested in your thoughts about what we should be thinking about in Atlantic Canada as we start building export and domestic hydrogen markets.
So I'll put on my consulting shoes. So if I was kind of given this assignment by Mark Carney and you there, how do we, as Canada? So the very first thing is I would probably go to the global buyers. So kind of this, let's say up to 70 ones who already bought. And I would ask them a very simple question. So now you have the opportunity to buy from, say, X number of geographies or a portfolio. Each of them has, different features. This one country, you don't even have to name it Canada, but just say this one country has A level historical reliability. How much premium versus the cheapest country in the list are you willing to pay for your green energy supply over the Atlantic? And I suspect, so that's my gut feel, that you will get, this is, based just on me being in the market. It's not yet founded on so I haven't conducted such a questionnaire yet, but my answer would be 15%. So let's say people are willing to consider reliability, but probably the real tolerance for price difference is something like, at least for things like green ammonia, I think is somewhere in the range of 15%. So now let's say on that 700 euro per ton. So, that would mean that you can charge maybe even 800 euro a ton, right? For something coming out of Canada. But that's probably the maximum of it, right? And obviously it's that 700 under border kind of move down, then your price would need to move down as well. So I think reliability is a really strong word, but what I am finding, and people want it, but so far, at least commercially, unless governments start imposing sorts of rules on this, and I'll come back to it in a moment, then I think that super true thing that people in Europe love Canada and see it as very reliable. Also, just here in Netherlands, some Canadian soldiers actually saved people, during the World War. So there is also, real kind of emotional attachment, at least with the ancestors of current European sisters and citizens. So I think that's all really helpful. But once you really get down to it, companies are willing to price it in a limited way. So what can you do? I mean, I can imagine, so taking a gas market as example. In gas market, there are things like, obligations to hold X amount of storage, and that's, an energy security obligation currently in place in Europe. One can imagine that if we move to strategic importing of hydrogen, we could start thinking of ideas like each company, if they're procuring globally, need to consider that, certain countries, they have at least in their portfolio, and there is at least, I don't know, I just say something like 5 diverse geographic sources of imported energy, right? So we kind of just put it in. I mean, Europeans are great in standardization and rules. Why not include that? And I wouldn't be surprised if, from this summer onwards, Europe will also finally start getting to updating its hydrogen strategy, because frankly, it's been kind of outdated now. There's been a European Court of Auditors report which said, look at it again. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start updating it. And if we start updating it, I think I would imagine that your association also may want to write a letter into consultation about it and say, hey, here are some of the ideas how we would look to it. What I like about Europe is now, I mean, if I look to, for example, consultations about even European energy grids, there is, all the big tech companies from US write letters, and Europe also considers those. So I think definitely my advice to Canadian stakeholders is, once that Europe starts kind of looking again at, okay, how do we want to organize, things like hydrogen mechanism, global procurement of hydrogen, come with ideas. And I mean, here's just that one idea, that there is more also public guide on building an international portfolio for the larger players in Europe who buy energy from across the border, including Canada.
Right. Okay. Erik, I think that's a really nice way to end this conversation. Thank you very much. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Future wherever you get your podcasts. Share it and tell someone who's thinking about the energy transition and about hydrogen's role in it. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so you can connect with us on LinkedIn, or you can learn more about our work at atlantichydrogen.ca. Thanks for listening.